Additions to my slides. So good morning, I am Paul Vixie and I'm here to talk about some things that are happening in DNS, but that's where they're happening, that's not what's happening. I want to explain some of the social and historical patterns that DNS is experiencing or is revealing for us. So ultimately what we're doing was described by Sting in a song on the Blue Turtles album, which is that we are building machines that we can't control and burying the waste in a great big hole. And that's always been true with the internet because conceptually you can understand any given part of it, but it's difficult to wrap your head around the totality. And that difficulty has now gone through the roof of infinity. It will not be possible for anyone to wrap their head around any totality starting about 2-3 years ago. When you have something like that, you get to another quote from another song. James Taylor described distant hands in foreign lands, moving hidden wheels, causing things to come about which no one really feels. And that is where we are with DNS and the latest things that are happening to it. However, I've made a life study of this, and I actually have some opinions on some of the specifics about how we got here. And the story must begin in 1648. There's a town in what is now Germany called Westphalia where they concluded a couple of treaties. They had a number of decades-long war. They actually referred to one of them as the 30 Years' War and the other one as the, 60 Years' War, something like that. And, the war at that time was a little bit less destructive and less immediately conclusive than we do it today with the types of munitions we have. But it was still just extraordinarily expensive. I'm sure they even called it blood and treasure. But before they could conclude peace, they had to figure out who was allowed to participate in the discussion. So those of you who were alive in 1967 or who have studied the history of that time know that when it was time to conclude the Vietnam War, they spent about 2 years negotiating about who would be in the room and what entity they would represent and what would be the shape of the conference table. Who would get to sit next to whom, which parts of the table would be flat, which ones would be round, who would be sitting across from whom. And it all seemed very silly to spend that much time arguing about the shape of a conference table while our young people were dying in combat. However, it became instantly wise rather than silly the day that they sat down at the conference table and concluded peace, because it turned out that the shape of the conference table had been a proxy for the shape of the post-war political alignment. And so by starting with the proxy war about the shape of the conference table, they were actually negotiating terms for 2 years. That's what happened a little bit same way in Westphalia. They had to decide who could come. And remember, Germany as a country didn't exist yet. That was yet to be formed. In fact, the United States, of course, didn't really exist yet. So the people who were there didn't say, oh, well, the nations ought to get together and decide who's going to stop fighting. What they said is, what exactly is a nation? How are we able to tell who represents one? And they thus codified some simple rules which helped them figure out who to negotiate with. A nation was any piece of dirt that had borders that could be defended, and that that law and order would be preserved within those boundaries such that there would be some government that was named who was responsible for any incursions outside those borders. So they literally said, you can keep what you can defend. If you are able to defend it, then we are going to call you a nation and we are going to negotiate about where your borders are and what wars you are no longer in. So I'd like to just say this was a fascinating bit of history, but has no relevance today, but this is still the version of nationhood that we use today. It is the version that the United States of America, which was officially founded more than 100 years later, uses now, almost 250 years later. It is the version of nationhood that the UN codified. It is still what we do. So what's interesting as to how we got from there to here is that there are domains of operations in both warfare and private affairs. And today we say there are 5: land, sea, air, space, and information. At that time, 1648, they only knew about the first 2. And so their treaties were written in terms of the first 2. Their definition of nationhood, which relied on your ability to defend something, was based on the first 2. The reason that they had borders as lines on a map describing patches of dirt is because superiority of force on land and on sea was all they understood. They did not foresee a time when a guy in a biplane with a machine gun could trivially cross a border that had heretofore been defended by people with swords or bayonets or whatever. They also did not expect that bird flu would someday come and make borders irrelevant. The borders that were understood in 1648 don't handle any of the things that came with air or air superiority. And needless to say, they did not foresee space or information as well. But this pattern has repeated. Whenever we add another domain of operations for either nations or corporations or even private individuals, we obsolete quite a bit of our previous thinking and quite a bit of the norms that used to govern sort of what we could expect to do in our own lifetimes, and importantly, what we could expect our competitors to do. And that means that we are right now way past living on borrowed time, because neither air, space, nor information respects borders. And yet we still have nations with more or less the same privileges, responsibilities that they had 400 years ago. This should worry us because the legal system of the world, both national and international law, presumes that, among other things, your government can keep you, your family, your business, your culture safe from attack by other nations. And they do this with kinetics. In other words, if there's an attack by land, sea, or air, then any given nation is going to have plenty of weapons that they can put on the land, into the sea, or into the air in order to make sure that that threat does not reach the local economy. We don't have anything like that for space, and we're never going to have anything like that for information. And so our international norms are not here in any relevant sense to affect what we will do in our careers. We are now sometimes fighting directly with nation states. Not that they always declare themselves as such, but we're just people. You know, we don't have the powers of nation states, but we have to defend digital assets against the people who do have those powers. And if you ever wonder why we seem to be destined to lose so much more often than win, let me tell you that that is one of the systemic defects in the approach that we took getting here. So, this was a talk a little bit about DNS. Let me show you how it works. There are 3 kinds of DNS protocol speakers. Stub resolvers, like the one in this laptop, are at the bottom. And questions come from here. Authority servers, like the root name servers or the com servers or even your name servers, assuming that you're hosting your personal domains at, let's say, GoDaddy or Network Solutions, or you might be running your own. Those are at the top. That's where the answers enter the system. And then inside of that center column, the answers flow downward when the questions flow upward. They meet in the middle at that thing called the recursive name server. Now, the recursive name server is the most complicated thing we have. It's got more lines of code, more memory, more bugs, more vulnerabilities, more sensitivity to DDoS. It is where everything important happens. The rest of this, you could almost write the code for it on the back of a matchbook, whereas that recursive server is quite the piece of complexity. Now you'll note three things. First, down below, between the stub resolvers and the recursive, there's personally identifiable information. That's because if you send a query, then it's going to have your IP address. Anyone who can look at the ARP table or the DHCP logs is going to be able to track down that IP address to your smartphone, your laptop, something that has your 48-bit MAC address. And within the question that you're sending represents not just a request of the recursive server to tell you something it knows, but a statement of your third-party intent. In other words, permission to go represent you to the rest of the world in order to find the information you need to go somewhere else. And anytime you combine personal identity with third-party intent, you have put the personal information, personal identifiable information knob all the way to the right. That is as strong as it can get. That's the best fit you could possibly have for the GDPR and the various rights that data subjects have. It's also a big deal for student privacy at universities. So you tend to want to keep that close. You don't want to expose that PII to a lot of intermediaries. You'd like to just have it go from the clients you're serving to the server you're running, and then you're doing a pretty good job keeping it close. Now you also see there's a cache on the left. That means that if you share information, somebody asks for something, and then later on somebody else in the same set of users asks for the same thing, they're going to get a copy of what the first guy got. And we like that because it makes it possible for not every question to reach the top, the authority server. And generally speaking, rule of thumb, there's about 20 times more traffic below the recursive than above. And so we're seeing some pretty good caching effects. And the third thing you'll see is a firewall. There's an IP firewall present in most managed private networks whereby only the recursive server itself is allowed to speak the DNS protocol to the rest of the world. And this keeps you from getting shadow IT, where somebody says, I didn't know we had a recursive server, so I started my own. Well, where'd you get it? I don't know, I got it off the net somewhere. Okay, so you just want to make that not work. Anyway, this is the traditional way that we did it, and this is the system topology that was part of. You had some users, they were on some kind of a LAN, used to be wired, now it tends to be wireless, and it's in some kind of a campus, might be your house or your apartment, or could actually be a university campus or a commercial building campus. That's going to have an ISP that fronts for it and connects it to the internet. So in the time of commercialization, privatization, we started moving the recursive name server function. That's the thing I told you you wanted to keep close because all of its traffic was very PII heavy. We've started moving that. It used to be that it was on the server, because in the 90s you often had only one computer, into the LAN. Let's put it on a Sun workstation. Maybe we don't need it on every LAN. Let's put it at the campus level. Oh, the ISP is offering that. Let's just stop running our own and just let the ISP do the recursive name service for us. And so, although I don't have any animation for it, I want you to imagine the recursive name service function starting at the bottom and then hop by hop moving further and further from where the questions enter the system. So, DNS is incredibly important. Turns out to be a good conference table to fight over the shape of. It is a proxy for control of other things because since it does demonstrate your third-party intent, it's a great thing to monitor to find out what ads you want to be seeing. They can look at what names you're looking up in order to target you for certain advertisements. So we've had some battles over control for the DNS resolution path. And I don't have time today to go through these in detail, but I urge you to send me email if you don't remember them and you'd like to see the longer version of this deck that I was compressing and making myself late today. First thing that happened is VeriSign, who operates .com, partnered with SiteFinder, who is an advertising company, so that they would no longer return any negative answer, no matter what garbage you typed in. If it ended in .com, you got an address. And this was really controversial. My company, a nonprofit that was responsible for Bind at the time, had a patch out on the street within 40 hours to restore the previous behavior. And we did not feel proud of that because the need to do it was embarrassing, and the added complexity did introduce bugs that we had to fix later. Nevertheless, we needed our negative answers. You need to know when something doesn't exist. That's part of your workflow so that you can skip parts of your inner loop that pertain to things that are errors. And SiteFinder VeriSign saw no reason for that. And there were a lot of lawsuits. I myself have a T-shirt designating me a verified SiteFinder co-conspirator. Some poor sheriff's deputy had to come to my house and hand me the legal papers to say, sorry, Paul, this is bigger than us, and don't apologize to me. Anyway, that was settled. And so the next thing that happened was that OpenDNS started. What they essentially said is, we've been moving the recursive server further and further from where the questions enter the system. How much further could we move it? Can it possibly get even further? And so they did. They put it at the far end of the internet so that your ISP would be bypassed, and you would send your DNS queries all the way to the far end of the universe to get them answered by OpenDNS. And they also did not send as many negative answers as they could have. But they were smarter about it. They actually gave you the address of an advertising server that had been chosen based on the name that you were asking questions about. So if you looked up something that existed, you got a true answer. But if you looked up something that didn't exist, they would send you directly to a place that would simply print an ad on your web browser that corresponded to the closest keyword they could find to the question that you asked. This also, highly controversial, made them no money, so they stopped doing it. They decided that the better thing to do was to intercept questions for www.google.com and give you their search page instead of Google's page. And they didn't actually do Google any harm. Because after you typed in whatever you were typing in and you hit the I'm feeling lucky button, it then sent you off to Google's service. They had no search engine. They had no way to compete with Google on search. And so Google got all the traffic they were otherwise going to get. The only difference was OpenDNS got to find out which keywords you were interested in so that, once again, they could target ads more effectively. And I don't know, I was not in the room at the time, but I suspect this may have played into the fact that 45 days later, 8.8 was created. Because there's no way to stop OpenDNS from doing that, but there is certainly a way to compete with them so that they get less traffic. The next war had to do with eDNS client subnet. This is where, going back a few slides, that PII I was talking about actually gets echoed in the questions that are forwarded between the middle box and the top box. And the reason for that is that Akamai and a lot of other content delivery networks needed to know what network you were coming from so that they could give you an answer that was optimal for that part of the internet topology. And a lot of us said, but wait, that's PII. And a lot of them said, oh, trust us, it'll be fine. Let me tell you, it's not fine. You're supposed to only include the network part. So let's say the /24 if it's IPv4, or the /56 if it's IPv6. But I operate a root name server, and I can tell you that we get a lot of eDNS client subnet that fully specifies the end user's IP address, because the people who wrote all of the software that are doing this did not read carefully that particular sentence of the RFC document. So eDNS client subnet was essentially another way to get control of the DNS resolution path. And I want to say that it is such a bad idea that not even Cloudflare at 1.1 will support it. They do not pass on this PII when they answer a question for somebody. Although that could be that they operate their own CDN, and so they want this information for their own routing purposes, but they wish to withhold it from their competitors. I'm not sure. Again, they don't tell me their reasons. But what we've done is to change the topology so that you are going as far as you can possibly get from where the questions enter the system before you finally reach that middle box that will try to answer your question. And it is now sending your PII to another faraway thing called a CDN. I imagine that we will someday change the topology so that there is a way to be further, and then we will move recursive DNS there. But right now, this is as far away as it can go. The laws of physics simply won't permit more distance. So when you put that many intermediaries in your path, you are exposing your information to an awful lot of people that you don't have contracts with. They may not have the same laws that you do. They might not be in your country. Their regulations might be different. And it's likely, statistically speaking, the more intermediate boxes you add, the more likely that at least one of them has interests that are not aligned with yours. If you want to know how this can be abused, go take a look at the disclosures Edward Snowden made in 2013 upon his occasion to fly to Hong Kong. I am no fan, but I will say that the information that he released was a surprise to many people. So the IETF said, look, if we're going to send this information to the furthest corner of the internet, then it should be encrypted. And so a working group got together and did something called DNS over TLS, and it is pretty good work. I didn't have a big part in it. My only role was to say, please use a different port number so that we don't have all of the problems of trying to negotiate which protocol's being spoken when you're talking to an older server that doesn't know the new thing. And they agreed to that. But it's pretty solid. It works. It works well enough that we could stop using UDP if we wanted to and just use DNS over TLS for all of our DNS now that we have TCP fast open. Nevertheless, this did not solve the problem. So the web part of the IETF continued working. They said, thank you very much for that encryption, but we want something in addition to privacy and authenticity. We want it to not be blockable. So we're going to develop something that hides it inside of TCP port 443 so that no middle box of any kind is able to then say, I refuse to forward this material based on its port number. And go ahead and read the RFC if you think I may be overstating their case. The information you're looking for is on page 1 of RFC 8484. So this is our new topology. So you've got that central 3 boxes, and we've added some on the right. It's now possible using DNS TAP and DNS RPZ for any recursive server operator to monitor what's going on and control, just add some policy to say, look, that's a configure command and control name. I don't wish to answer truthfully because I may have a bot that needs to know how to reach the command and control, so I'm just going to block that. I suppose you could use it for other things like that's porn or whatever, but generally what we see is people like the folks in this room blocking the stuff that would make their days and nights longer if it weren't blocked. You still see that firewall there, trying to keep it so that only your recursive server can get out. But now we have this whole other thing on the left, which are applications doing DNS, such as Mozilla, Firefox, and Google Chrome. And they are now speaking directly to a DNS over HTTPS endpoint, and you may be able to see that the firewall is not in the way of that. Putting the firewall in the way of that is the most expensive thing that you could think to want to do. And you will seriously consider giving up before you actually endure the cost of trying to block that traffic. And that's deliberate. So, I worry about this for a lot of reasons. You can't actually solve a political problem with technology, because what will happen is your political opponent will also try to solve the problem you just made for them with technology. So this is a game of escalation, and if you want to solve a political problem, then escalation has not proven itself as an effective way to do it. Sometimes the proponents of this say, well, there are dissidents, they want to be able to say bad things about their country without getting arrested. Well, let me tell you, if you encrypt your DNS, but you're not using a VPN for everything else, then the IP destination address of the next packet you send after the question and answer they couldn't read will tell them where you're going. Once they know where you're going, they know what question you must have asked. And so if you really intend to stay out of jail in an authoritarian regime, you're going to need something a lot stronger than DOH. So anybody who says that that is the use case is either misinformed or that's a talking point, and they may or may not even know they're lying, but that is not what's going to happen. And I want to note, the web is certainly, the reason the internet is so profitable is because of the web. The web is the biggest application the internet has, but it is still smaller than the internet. And it happens from time to time that I will click on something and it will launch an app on my laptop. And if that app is doing DNS to a different server than the one the browser used, it's possible that they're going to get different answers, and I'm going to see some incoherency. So the idea that we can now forget about the internet and just make everything part of the web seems premature. It also seems darkly bad. But perhaps the larger problem is that you have parents using this kind of thing for parental controls. You've got sysadmins, CISOs, and authoritarian governments, and ISPs who want to do advertising targeting. And DOH has no way to tell which of these you are. And so there's no get out of DOH free card. There is the expectation that this could be an ISP data mining their customers. This could be an authoritarian government trying to lock up their dissidents. Therefore, everybody has to get painted with the same brush. Painting a lot of different people who have different motives with the same brush hasn't ended well in the part of human history that I have read. And I do want to say I meet people from time to time who are sure that the Chinese Communist Party is no different from the Soviets, in that it was possible to have a Cold War that was so expensive that the Soviet Empire collapsed trying to build as many missiles as the United States did. And so they believe they can do this now in the fifth domain, information technology, basically bankrupt China while they try to keep up with this. The situations are not parallel. I do not think that there is an amount of money that the one-party system in China can be asked to pay that they won't pay, because if they don't have this, the party itself ceases to exist. So the internet is a network of networks, whereas the web is a network of human eyeballs that are consuming ads, or at least economically that is the case. And a lot of us are expecting to start enforcing a mandatory proxy at the border of our networks so that everything gets strip searched on its way out the door because it might be this. And by design, TLS 1.3 encrypted SNI is going to mean that none of the current man-in-the-middle technology we're using for TCP 443 is going to keep working. It's already beginning to fail. It will fully fail within a couple of years. But if you enforce a proxy, that only really helps your browsers. IoTs don't have a way to let you tell them what proxy you want them to use. So I think this is going to drastically change the uptake of IoT devices inside of managed private networks, such as corporate or family networks. This is by design, and it gets us back toward our topic of the Treaty of Westphalia. I want to point out, I started out the first anti-spam company in 1995-96 timeframe. So we invented the real-time black hole list, the RBL that a lot of you are using. I don't publish information in that form anymore because I got sued a lot, but we developed the idea of distributed reputation, and when we were trying to decide sort of who belonged on the list and who didn't, what we ended up with as our rubric was, well, if a lot of spam is coming from a network, and if the operator of that network says, look, there's nothing I can do, it's from my customers, then we would say, I'm sorry, if that's your attitude, then we are not going to accept any traffic from your network. Because if it's coming out of your factory and going into our river and poisoning our fish, then it's your problem. And if you want to make it our problem, then we're going to have a fight about that. So I'm not sure what would happen today where what people could say is, well, you know, I'm doing the best I can to block this stuff, but the DDoS that you are holding me responsible for was entirely over DOH, which I can't block, so please don't hold me responsible for it. I don't want to go into a recourse-free era where nobody who does or enables anything on the internet can possibly be expected to stop it. So, I don't like the rule of the strongest. I know that we had that for the first couple of million years of human evolution, but we're supposed to not go backward in that way, and that's what we're doing here. Now, lest you think that that's as bad as it gets, I assure you that the web is entirely funded by advertising. So all of the server technology, all the browser technology, all of the protocol changes are ultimately meant to make it possible to reduce the time between when you click a mouse and when the first photon of the next advertisement strikes your eyeball. That time is measurable by the people who make money, and they make more when that time is less. And so there's a great deal of pressure on the web right now to get rid of DNS as we know it, because DNS as we know it involves questions. We have to, as we're reading, our browser's reading some index.html file, it will encounter object references. You know, here's an image, here's some JavaScript, here's a style sheet, here's stuff you need to go fetch. And while it's still receiving that, it's parsing inline, finding those references and asking DNS questions about them, and then actually fetching all of those other objects in parallel to the extent that that's possible. But that is too slow. And so what we're going to see shortly is that the DNS information necessary to fetch subsidiary objects will be included in the meta headers of the parent object that is referencing them. Because that way there's no time lost while you ask a question, and there's also no possible risk that your question might get intercepted by an ad blocker. So the DNS is coming as part of the web. They're going to use something called server push to make sure that the browser keeps its cache up to date. And they are not going to use DNSSEC or any other method of determining that this is authentic information. From their point of view, TLS gives them authenticity. It hasn't occurred to them that, sort of like with the same origin policy for cookies, there have to be limits as to what you're willing to trust a web server to tell you. This is coming. It's not coming this calendar year, but I believe you will see newspaper headlines about this by summer of next year. Not totally sure what we're going to do about this. Very few of us compile a browser from source, and I'm not totally sure that any of the browser makers is going to give us a knob where we can say, ignore all of the resolverless DNS you're going to receive, ask the questions. Because again, that would be a gateway to you having an ad blocker, which is not in the interest of the people who actually pay for all this stuff. If we could just find a premium browser where we pay them $50 a year to not do bad things like this, that would be great. but $50 a year is chump change compared to how much money they can make by doing this to us. There's no way we would ever be willing to pay the alternative profit of them getting our information and having control of our eyeballs in the way that they do. So finally, there was a time when the Dutch East India Company was a crown corporation, and the British East India Company was another crown corporation, and they were signing treaties. And that's a little bit odd. We don't see corporations signing treaties today. But these were, after all, crown corporations, so they sort of were proxies for the respective kingdoms. And so they used to, go visit some new part of the India subcontinent's coast and go ashore and say, well, we represent the thus and so East India Company, and we would like to trade with you. And then there would be something having the force of treaty, but it was between a corporation and a country. And that's fallen out of favor. We don't do that type of colonialism anymore. We have a new kind. So Mozilla has decided that they're going to turn this on and wait for people to complain. It's not an opt-in affair. They're going to turn on DOH for their users in the United States, and they're going to put a pop-up to let you know that it has happened, giving you a chance to object. And this is a little bit like when you carefully select your route with Google Maps, and then as you're on your way out of town, it'll pop up with something that says, hey, I found a faster route, let's go use the superhighway. And before you can get your gloves off and say, hit the I don't want that button, you're on the freeway. And that's kind of what's going to happen with this Mozilla thing. And they've chosen Cloudflare as their trusted recursive resolver. So instead of you sending your DNS questions to your configured system name server, you're going to be sending them to Cloudflare. There may be others in the future, but right now it's Cloudflare. Now, this used to be considered rude. You just wouldn't do this. You would say, here's an opt-in opportunity. This would be faster. This would be safer. Do you want to use this? And if there's no answer, then it goes away. But now it's opt-out. And nonprofit public benefit charities didn't used to behave that way, but here we are. So the British government was worried about this. They've got laws about what must be blocked, and if you break those laws, you will be you'll be in jail before you even have a chance to redress their grievances. And so they asked the Mozilla leadership to come to London and have a meeting, at which the Mozilla Corporation agreed not to do in the UK what they're doing in the US, which I suppose was very high-minded of them. But this is only the first of many applications that are going to do DNS. And this is the first of many countries who are going to wish it wasn't happening. And I'm not sure that this approach is going to scale. I think what's going to happen is that we're just going to slip into the era where people don't have control of their DNS. Now, there was a time when you had to cooperate from one end of the path to the other in order to be successful. If you didn't speak the protocol correctly, you wouldn't be heard. If you didn't respect identifier allocations and code point allocations that came from the internet itself, then you would not be able to successfully reach other parties. And that cooperation also took the form of traffic blocking, right? It's still impossible to do wide area SNMP because there was a Cisco bug in 1998 which allowed you to read somebody's SNMP variables out of a router without knowing the SNMP password. So everybody just blocked it. Throughout the world, you still can't get reliable SNMP service. And that's because we used to say, I own this part of the network. We can have the alignment that you see here, or if something's happening that I don't like, I can move the opening in my particular line up or down, thus causing certain traffic not to pass. That's also what we did with the spam blocking service, the real-time black hole list. This is what we have now, which is that there's an internet standard telling you how to get to the other end regardless of the wishes of anybody who owns or controls anything along the path. And this gives us only bad choices. And when you find yourself faced with only bad choices, it was usually engineered that way. It'll hardly ever be the case that you're walking along minding your own business and all of a sudden you hit a fork on the road and both sides of the fork are on fire. Usually if you get there, it's because somebody wanted you to face bad choices. So your one choice is to give up and just say, well, that's the new way. And I'm not going to try to stop my malware from doing DNS queries that I can't monitor or control. My intruders can do whatever they want. If somebody brings in a BYOD and it is set up to work this way, then it won't be part of our master control system whereby nobody has their own administrative password, and we're just going to leave it alone, just let it all happen. Because there's a new model called the Beyond Corp model, where you don't have perimeters anymore and you simply secure every endpoint. Any of you who has had a smart TV start behaving as though its tiny little JavaScript mind was also running a Bitcoin miner understands the challenge of trying to secure an endpoint if you can't use DNS to find out what it's doing so that you know it needs help. You could create much smaller networks and just whitelist the things that network should be talking to, but that changes every day. That's a fool's errand. And I've got a Chromecast. It ignores my DHCP as far as the assignment of recursive name service. It always uses 8.8.8.8. And so in order to get the Chromecast to work at all and to think that it's on net and to actually show YouTube videos in my bedroom, I have to give it an 8.8.8.8 to talk to, because when I was growing up, the internet was a network of networks, and on my network, 8.8 meant whatever I wanted it to mean. But the people who make these devices are never going to earn a profit from the money they collect by selling it. All of the money they make from selling it goes into the manufacturing, distribution, and support. The only profit margin any of these things have is the data they can collect on us and the ads they can target or the ads they can deliver. So their interests are not aligned with mine, probably not with yours either. Another sad prediction I have is that as LTE modems get cheaper and as 5G comes along, these devices are going to stop using my home Wi-Fi, because I, statistically speaking, am not reliable enough as its ISP to be able to let it earn its profit. We had the problem of replacing a furnace controller last year, and it took quite a while to find one on a shelf somewhere that was the older version that was not also an IoT device. Google swears up and down, if you gave them a Bible and they had a hand, they'd put their hand on a Bible and swear that they did not know that Nest thermostat had a microphone, and they never, ever, ever turned it on. Okay, I understand that, but you're not the only one out there, and most of them are a lot less competent. So staking my future, and I think in this room you understand how privacy relates to safety, staking the safety of my family on the generalized competency of people who make these devices is a bad bet. The other thing you could do is not give up. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Even if you're a private network operator and you're not selling connectivity, you can still have an acceptable use policy, and you can still enforce it. You can cause these IoT devices to be less profitable because they aren't being bought by anybody who actually watches the traffic leaving their network. This is a tough sell, because who does not want to live in that Jetsons future where we've got flying cars? Well, if we have flying cars, they're going to be spying on you. And so there are choices we have to make. There is a way to do virtualization on a laptop where, in addition to having virtual guests, it has a firewall that all of those guests have to pass through. And I fully expect that next time I am here, I'll be running something like that with an outbound HTTPS proxy, so that anything inside my private little universe here is going to get strip searched at the border, and if it's doing something I don't like, then it's not going to work, because you can't trust your apps, not even if they come from a nonprofit public charity, because their interests are now definitely not aligned with yours. So this takes us to a terrible place, where we are adding complexity to a system that we already struggled to understand on our best day. And it is the ratio or the fraction of things that we have that we actually understand that is the leading term of our total risk. So ideally, whenever any of us buys a new firewall, we also invest in some kind of training so that the people who are responsible for the entirety of the network that now has this new bit of complexity called a firewall have also increased the numerator, but nothing increases n. In fact, n just gets thinner all the time. We're spreading the rate at which the global clue supply grows is far less than the rate at which global complexity is growing. So if you were trying to enumerate systemic defects that are responsible for why we seem to lose so often, look here and note that an increase in Q has now been imposed upon us. Whether we give up or whether we don't, Q is on its way up again. So I actually said to a reporter what's written in yellow, and they did what reporters do. They went to various companies that were also mentioned in the article and said, well, Dr. Vixie said this, what's your response? And these two companies have got well-developed PR machines with a lot of talking points, and so they each said something which, if you know everything about it, you know are lies, but no one knows everything about it, and so they seem reasonable on the face of them. And so this is now sort of talking to an extremist and a moderate and asking how come they can't compromise, as opposed to thinking everybody's an extremist and hoping that they will compromise toward moderation. In any case, these are corporate persons, and so if you've heard the aphorism that it takes an order of magnitude more effort to combat bullshit than to generate it, then you have to understand that these corporate persons actually have many orders of magnitude more energy than I do. And so I'm probably not going to win this PR war. But the same day that that happened, I got this, and I got to tell you that I have never interacted with eBay from my NetBSD account, so if I see those two symbols next to each other, I know I've just been spammed or phished or what have you. I liked being able to then do 30 seconds of research to find out where their name servers are and make sure that none of their names was possible to resolve on any device in my network, because they clearly mean me harm and I don't need to give them any privileges. They're effectively giving me carte blanche to remove them from my view of the internet. So now finally we come to this guy. So this is the original quote that underlies the aphorism that every man's house is a castle, and in it he is king. And I have to say, this made sense in a world that only had air and land as domains of operations. But if the king wants to use DNS over HTTPS, then that house is not a castle, that man is not a king. And that's the kind of impedance mismatch you get when you build a system of laws, cultures, norms around some set of domains of operations, and then a new one comes along that renders it all obsolete. I don't think that everybody is going to worry about butterfly effects about everything they do. But I do wish people would look for the obvious next steps, right? The first thing to do if you want to learn game theory is to recognize that there will be turns taken. There will be moves after the one you make. And if you could just sort of get it through your head that, I'm going to do this and then it's going to provoke some kind of counter reaction, anybody doing that much thought would have realized that DOH is going to take us to a place where everybody has less safety, less privacy. But they're not doing that. And this is brutal. The idea of rule of the strongest, where whoever can get the most code out the fastest ends up determining the way that everybody else will live, is not how the internet got started. I know we had to disintermediate the old phone companies, or we'd all be using Minitel now. But I didn't think we were going to disintermediate the open source community and the community of security engineers like ourselves. You guys are looking at PCAP files and using it to figure out how things are behaving. Everything is about to be in a TLS session using TLS 1.3 and encrypted SNI, and your PCAPs will be useless, and that is by design. And you were the last hope we had that this era wasn't going to turn into a dumpster fire for every family. So, I am not hopeful as I speak to you today. But in every domain of operations, everybody seeks supremacy. Land supremacy, sea supremacy, air supremacy, space supremacy, IT supremacy. Let me tell you, the governments of the world do not have IT supremacy. The corporations have it. That's not going to change in our lifetime. Thank you all for sitting with me. I'll be here till tomorrow morning, and I'll be happy to talk to anybody at the bar, but there are people in the back of the room letting me know that I am out of time. Do I have time for questions?